A very, very long time ago, before anyone had even thought of emperors, palaces, or dynasties, people lived simply on the land that would one day be called China. It was a time when there were no written records, no grand cities, and no famous names written in stone. But even without those things, people were already doing something incredible, building the beginnings of a civilization. Life back then was centered around the rivers, especially the powerful Yellow River, which the people called the Mother River. The river wasn't just a source of water, it was life itself. It brought rich, muddy soil that was perfect for farming. And so people settled near it, slowly giving up hunting and gathering to grow crops like millet. These early folks were clever, even though they had no books to learn from. They figured out how to dig irrigation ditches to bring water to their crops. They built homes out of mud and wood, huddled together for warmth and protection. And they didn't just focus on survival, they also created beautiful pottery, painted with swirls and patterns that showed a love for design and detail. Over many generations, tiny villages turned into something a bit more organized. People began to form little communities with leaders, rules, and shared traditions. It wasn't a kingdom yet, not even close. But it was the very first step. Now, because no one wrote things down back then, we don't know exactly what happened. But stories were passed down, legends whispered from grandparents to grandchildren, sitting by fires under starlit skies. And those stories would become the myths of ancient China. One of the most famous figures in these tales was a man named Yu the Great. According to legend, Yu wasn't born great. He earned that title. The story goes that long ago, massive floods were destroying villages, drowning crops, and forcing people to flee from the rising water. Everyone was terrified. It seemed like the gods were angry, and no one knew how to stop it. Yu's father, Gun, tried first. He tried to build giant dikes to block the water, but the floods only grew worse. After 9 years of trying and failing, Gun was punished by the gods. Then Yu stepped in, but he didn't try to block the water. Instead, he studied it. He traveled across the land, watched how rivers flowed, and found ways to redirect them. He dug channels, let the water go where it wanted, and gave it paths to flow peacefully. The people said he worked day and night, never stopping. In fact, one version of the story says he passed by his own home 3 times and never once went in, too focused on saving others. After years of hard work, the floods finally receded, and the land became fertile again. Grateful and amazed, the people made him their leader. And just like that, legend says the Yuxia dynasty was born. Now let's pause for a second. We should be honest. Historians still debate whether the Yuxia dynasty really existed, or if it was just a beautiful story passed down through time. There's no solid proof. No ancient documents or monuments that clearly show Yu the Great was real. But what we do know is that something important was happening in those years. People were gathering, settling, farming, crafting tools, creating societies. And honestly, whether Yu the Great was real or just a symbol, he represents something true. People learning to work with nature instead of fighting it. He shows how early Chinese values, hard work, loyalty, respect for nature, were already taking root. As we go deeper into what might have been the Yuxia period, we start seeing signs of early leadership. Archaeologists have found ruins from this time, small cities with defensive walls, drainage systems, and cemeteries. We're talking about places like Early Tu, a site that many believe could be part of the Yuxia. It had palaces, workshops, and beautiful jade carvings. It even had bronze objects, which was a big deal back then. Bronze wasn't easy to make. You needed tin, copper, heat, and skill. So when a culture started making bronze tools or ceremonial vessels, it meant they were advancing quickly. It also meant they had leaders, because someone had to organize the work, decide what to make, and control the resources. And that brings us to another important part of early Chinese life, the sense of order. Even in these early times there was this idea that things had their place. The sky was above, the earth was below, and people were in between. Families had elders, villages had leaders, and everyone had roles. Harmony wasn't just a nice idea, it was the goal. This is also when early spiritual beliefs started to form. People believed that ancestors were watching over them. They prayed to spirits and made offerings. If someone died, they didn't disappear. They joined the world of the ancestors. And so people built tombs, buried their loved ones with care, and even placed precious objects beside them, hoping to honor their journey into the next life. Over time, rituals became more formal. Special ceremonies were held to speak to the ancestors or ask the gods for help. And these rituals weren't just about religion, they were a way to bring people together, to remind everyone of their shared past and responsibilities. The rhythm of life was shaped by nature. The rising of the river, the changing of the seasons, the growth of the crops. People depended on the land, respected it, and feared it too. Droughts could kill a harvest. Floods could wash away everything. So festivals were held to pray for rain, for sun, for balance. Children were raised with stories. Maybe they heard about the Yellow Emperor, another legendary figure said to have invented things like carts, boats, and writing. Or the tale of Fuxi and Niwa, a brother and sister who created humans from clay. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were blueprints for how to live, how to treat others, and how to understand the world. As these early people settled and expanded, trade began to form. One village might grow more grain than it needed. Another might be good at crafting tools or weaving cloth. Slowly they began to exchange what they had for what they needed. It was the beginning of economy. And with trade came travel. People started to move more, to explore nearby regions. They brought back new ideas, new customs, and new challenges. Sometimes they met friendly neighbors. Sometimes they met enemies. Conflicts broke out, alliances were formed, and people began to understand that power mattered. So leaders became more important, not just because they were strong, but because they could guide, decide, and bring people together. Whether those early leaders were called kings or chiefs, we'll never know for sure. But they were the first sparks of what would one day become emperors. And in the middle of all this, people still lived their everyday lives. A woman might spend her day grinding millet, singing quietly to her child. A boy might help his father repair the roof of their home. Families gathered in the evening, telling stories as the stars came out. They laughed, they worried, they hoped. The Yijie period, or the time we call the Yi, wasn't flashy. There were no grand armies, no giant stone monuments like in Egypt, but that's what makes it beautiful. It was humble, human, and deeply rooted in nature. As we look back on this time, we see not just the beginning of China, but the beginning of a way of thinking, a culture that valued balance, family, wisdom, and harmony. It was the soil from which everything else would grow. And though the winds of time have erased many of its details, the story of this dawn lives on in legends, in broken pottery, in the ruins of ancient towns, and in the hearts of people who still tell tales of Yu the Great, of floods, and of a world slowly waking up. This was just the start, but it was a powerful one. So, after the early days of scattered farming villages and mysterious legends about flood tamers and magical emperors, something big started to shift in the land that would one day be known as China. People were no longer just surviving. They were building, planning, organizing their world in a way that felt much more official. That's when the Shang dynasty stepped into the story. Now, here's the cool part. Unlike the Shai dynasty, which still lives in a sort of historical gray zone, the Shang left behind real physical proof that they existed, and not just bits and pieces, whole cities, bronze tools, oracle bones, with writing on them, even royal tombs stuffed with treasures. So when we talk about the Shang, we're not just dealing with myth. We're dealing with one of the first truly confirmed dynasties in Chinese history. The Shang people chose to settle along the Yellow River, just like the early ones before them. That river was still the lifeline of the land. Its rich soil made farming easier, and its steady waters made it possible to transport things. As more people came together under the leadership of a ruling family, they formed something that looked a lot like a kingdom, a real one, with palaces, walls, armies, taxes, and rules. At the heart of this dynasty was a city called Yin, near modern-day Yingyang. And wow, what a city it must have been. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of massive palaces with wide courtyards, temples, and even found the ruins of a huge royal cemetery. In those tombs were jade ornaments, bronze vessels, weapons, and chariots, but also, tragically, human sacrifices. Because the Shang had some pretty intense customs when it came to the afterlife. So let's talk about that for a second. In Shang culture, the afterlife wasn't a vague, misty place. It was real, active, and full of ancestors. And those ancestors, they were powerful. People believed that spirits of dead family members could influence what happened in the world of the living. Crops, weather, childbirth, health, war, pretty much everything depended on whether your ancestors were happy or mad. Because of this belief, the Shang developed something fascinating and spooky: oracle bones. These were usually turtle shells or the shoulder bones of oxen. A diviner, kind of like a spiritual advisor, would carve a question into the bone. Something like, will it rain next week, or should we attack the neighboring tribe? Then the bone would be heated with a hot poker until it cracked. And those cracks, they were read like a message from the spirits, kind of like a magical conversation between the living and the dead. Here's where it gets even better. Those inscriptions, they're the earliest known form of Chinese writing. That's right. The modern Chinese script, with all its graceful, complex characters, has roots that go all the way back to those oracle bones. Some of the symbols carved into those ancient bones are still recognizable today. So picture this: a king sitting on a carved wooden throne, surrounded by nobles and diviners. The king asks the spirits if he should go to war. The diviner carefully etches the question into the bone, heats it, studies the cracks, and delivers the message. Based on that message, the king makes a decision that could change the future of his people. The king wasn't just a ruler, he was the bridge between heaven and earth, between the living and the dead. That's how power worked in Shang society. It wasn't just political, it was spiritual, and that power was organized. The Shang king ruled over a central territory, but he didn't try to control every village directly. Instead, he let local leaders manage their own towns as long as they stayed loyal and paid tribute. This kind of feudal system allowed the kingdom to stretch wider and keep things running smoothly. Now let's zoom into the daily lives of ordinary people during the Shang era. Most of them were farmers. They grew millet, wheat, and rice, depending on the region. They raised pigs, chickens, and cattle. Life wasn't easy. There were taxes to pay, seasons to follow, and tools were still pretty basic. But people had strong families, close-knit villages, and traditions that gave them purpose. Artisans and craftsmen were another important group. And let me tell you, Shang artisans were talented. The bronze work from this period is legendary. They made beautiful, intricate vessels for rituals. Imagine a large bronze pot shaped like a beast with swirling patterns carved into it, every line perfect. These vessels weren't just for cooking. They were sacred. They were used to make offerings to the ancestors and to the gods. To make bronze, you needed to know how to melt copper and tin and pour it into complex molds. It wasn't easy, but the Shang had it down to a science. Their mastery of bronze making set them apart from neighboring cultures. It showed they had organization, knowledge, and people dedicated to their craft. Then there were the warriors, because yes, the Shang dynasty was no peaceful utopia. Warfare was common. The king kept a standing army, trained and ready. They had bronze weapons, swords, spears and arrowheads that gave them an edge in battle. And they had chariots, pulled by horses. These were fast, light and deadly on the battlefield. Enemies were all around. Other tribes and groups constantly challenged Shang rule. Sometimes the Shang won and expanded their territory. Other times they had to retreat. The borders were always shifting, and keeping the kingdom together required strength and strategy. But what really held everything together beyond the soldiers and the bronze was belief. Religion and tradition were the glue. Everyone understood their place in the cosmos. The king was at the top, chosen by the ancestors. Below him were nobles, warriors, artisans and farmers. And at the very bottom, unfortunately, slavery was real and harsh during this time. Prisoners of war were often made into slaves. Some were forced to work on construction projects or serve in households. Others were used in sacrificial rituals. It's a grim part of the story, but it was part of that world. Speaking of rituals, let's go back to the tombs for a moment. One of the most incredible discoveries from this period was the tomb of Fu Hao. She was a queen, a priestess, and a general, all rolled into one. Her tomb, uncovered in the 1970s, was packed with over 1,000 treasures. There were jade carvings, bronze weapons, cowrie shells used as money, and yes, human sacrifices. Fu Hao wasn't just a royal wife. She led troops into battle. She performed important rituals. And the fact that she was buried with so much honor shows us that powerful women weren't just rare exceptions. They were possible even back then. The Shang dynasty lasted for over 500 years. That's a long time to keep a kingdom going in the ancient world. But no dynasty lasts forever. Near the end, things started to fall apart. The last Shang king, Di Xin, is remembered as a cruel and indulgent ruler. He's said to have built a lake of wine, forced people to drink until they drowned, and ignored the suffering of his people. Now we don't know how much of that is true and how much is legend added later by his enemies. But what's clear is this: the people were unhappy. The kingdom had become unstable. Local leaders began to rebel. And one of them, a tribe called the Zhou, was about to make their move. In the final battle, Di Xin was defeated. According to the stories, he retreated to his palace, set it on fire, and died inside. The Shang dynasty came to an end. But its legacy lived on, because the Shang didn't just rule a kingdom. They laid the groundwork for what China would become. Writing, rituals, runes casting, political structure, spiritual beliefs. All of it started here in this fascinating, complicated era where humans and ancestors, kings and gods, lived in one connected universe. The Shang were builders of more than cities. They were builders of culture. And in the ruins they left behind, in the cracked oracle bones and the dusty jade pendants, you can still hear echoes of their world. So, let's pick up where we left off. The Shang dynasty had fallen. Its last king, Di Xin, was gone, burned in his own palace according to the tales. The people were tired of chaos, tired of cruelty, and ready for something new. And into that wide open space stepped the Zhou. The Zhou tribe had been around for a while by then. They weren't just some random group rising out of nowhere. They'd been living to the west of the Shang heartland, watching, learning and building their strength. And when the Shang started to collapse under its own weight, the Zhou were ready to take the stage. Now here's something really interesting. The Zhou didn't just show up, defeat the Shang, and say, hey, we're in charge now. No, they came in with an idea. A big idea. A philosophical idea, actually. They introduced the world to something called the Mandate of Heaven. This idea changed Chinese history forever. According to the Zhou, the right to rule didn't come from birth or power alone. It came from heaven. But here's the twist: heaven could take it away. If a ruler became corrupt, violent, or just plain terrible, heaven would withdraw its blessing. Natural disasters, revolts, famine, those were signs that the ruler had lost the mandate. And then, a new dynasty had the right to step in. This concept served a clever purpose. It explained why the Shang had fallen, and it justified the Zhou taking over. It also gave the people hope. If things got bad under a new ruler, they didn't have to feel stuck. Heaven, they believed, would eventually fix it. With that idea in place, the Zhou began building their world. Their early years, known as the Western Zhou, were strong and steady. They set up their capital at Hajing, near modern-day Xuan, and ruled with a tight but respectful grip. The Zhou kings weren't just rulers. They were spiritual leaders, caretakers of tradition, and defenders of harmony. But the Zhou Empire was big, way bigger than anything the Shang had managed, and ruling over so many different regions, with all their different people and needs, was no easy task. So the Zhou came up with a solution. They created a feudal system. Basically, the king kept the central lands close under his control, but he gave out the outer lands to family members and loyal followers. These nobles became the rulers of their own small states, still loyal to the king, but able to handle things locally. It worked, at least at first. Over time, though, something started to go wrong. Those local rulers got stronger. They began to act more like kings in their own right. And some of them, well, they didn't always feel like obeying orders from the capital. Then came disaster. In 71 BCE, a group of rebellious nobles, along with some fierce nomads from the west, attacked the Zhou capital. The city burned. The king was killed. And just like that, the Western Zhou era was over. But the dynasty itself didn't end there. The Zhou moved east, setting up a new capital at Luoyang. This began the Eastern Zhou period. And let me tell you, this was a wild ride. The Eastern Zhou period is often divided into two parts: the Spring and Autumn period, and the Warring States period. And trust me, both were dramatic, messy, and deeply important. Let's start with the Spring and Autumn period, named after a book called The Spring and Autumn Annals that recorded the history of that time. From 770 to 476 BCE, China was technically still under Zhou rule, but in reality the Zhou king had very little power. The real action was happening in the many small states that had once been loyal. Some of these states were huge and powerful, like Qi, Jin, and Ch. Others were smaller but still played the game. These states were constantly at war, forming alliances, breaking them, spying on each other, and fighting for dominance. And all the while the Zhou king sat in Luoyang, more like a symbol than a ruler. But this time wasn't all doom and gloom. Far from it. In fact, it was one of the most brilliant times in Chinese history when it came to culture and ideas. You see, all this political chaos got people thinking. How do you build a peaceful society? What makes a good ruler? What is the nature of humanity? These questions gave rise to some of the most famous philosophers in Chinese history. This is when Confucius came onto the scene. Born in 55-1 BCE, he lived during the later part of the Spring and Autumn period. He wasn't a king or a general. He was a teacher, a thinker, and a lover of history. He believed that society could only function if people respected their roles and treated each other with kindness. His ideas about filial piety, respecting your parents, ritual, doing things the proper way, and benevolence, being kind and just, would go on to shape Chinese civilization for thousands of years. But Confucius wasn't the only one. There were Taoists, who believed in going with the flow of the universe. There were legalists, who thought people were naturally selfish and needed strict laws to behave. And then there were Mohists, who argued that love and peace should guide all decisions. The Eastern Zhou was like a giant debate club with swords. Everyone was fighting and arguing, but also learning from each other. It was exhausting and brilliant at the same time. Eventually the spring and autumn period gave way to something even more intense, the Warring States period, which lasted from 4075 to 21 BCE. By this time the Zhou kings were basically forgotten. China had split into 7 major states, each hungry for power. These states, Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin, went full Game of Thrones on each other. They built huge armies. They hired strategists. They constructed walls and towers and weapons of war. Millions of people were caught in the middle of this never-ending fight for dominance. But even in the middle of all this chaos, progress kept happening. Iron tools replaced bronze. Farming became more efficient. Cities grew bigger. Trade routes formed. And perhaps most importantly, governments became more organized. The warring states weren't just wild kingdoms fighting each other. They were becoming real states with laws, taxes, infrastructure, and strategy. Rulers wanted power, but they also wanted order, and that meant improving how they governed. One of the most fascinating figures from this time was a man named Shang Yang, who worked for the Qin state. He pushed legalist ideas, harsh laws, strict discipline, and powerful rulers. And even though people feared his policies, Qin got stronger, much stronger. And so after nearly 800 years, the Zhou dynasty's time finally ran out. The dynasty had started with a dream, a mandate from heaven, a noble vision of balance and order. But over centuries it had slowly crumbled under the weight of its own size and its own weaknesses. By the end, the Zhou king was a shadow, and the real power rested in the hands of ruthless warlords. And in the West, a new power was rising. The state of Qin, hardened by war, shaped by legalism, and led by a ruler with terrifying ambition. That ruler would one day call himself the first emperor. But that's a story for the next chapter. The Zhou dynasty may have ended in fragments, but its legacy is anything but broken. It gave the world ideas that still echo today. The mandate of heaven, the teachings of Confucius, the roots of Chinese philosophy, politics, and tradition. And so the Zhou pass into history, not with one big crash, but with a long, dramatic sunset. A dynasty that lit the sky with both brilliance and storms, and whose light helped guide the empires to come. Alright, so now we're stepping into one of the most intense and dramatic chapters in all of Chinese history. This is where things get real. No more symbolic kings or powerless dynasties. The age of philosophies and polite debates gives way to something different, something louder, something sharper, something carved into stone walls and shouted from the mountaintops. Welcome to the Qin dynasty. It was short, only about 15 years long, but in that little sliver of time, the Qin reshaped the entire map of China, redefined what an emperor was, and laid the groundwork for everything that came after. It was brutal. It was brilliant. And it all started with one man. His name was Ying Zheng, but you probably know him better as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Let's rewind for a moment. Back in the last chapter, we talked about the Warring States period, where all those feudal states were clawing at each other for power. One of those states was Qin, tucked away in the western regions. They weren't originally the biggest or the richest, but they were disciplined. They were organized. And thanks to legalist reforms, they had built a machine of a government that could move faster and strike harder than anyone else. Ying Zheng became the king of Qin when he was just a teenager. But don't let the age fool you. He was sharp, ruthless, and ambitious in a way that makes other rulers look like they were sleepwalking. He didn't want to just win battles. He wanted to end war itself, not by making peace, but by conquering everyone. And that's exactly what he did. Over a series of brutal, calculated campaigns, Qin took out the other 6 major states: Han, Zhao, Yan, Wei, Chu, and Qi. One by one he crushed them. His generals like Wang Jian used a mix of patience and raw power. Cities fell, fortresses burned, armies surrendered or were annihilated. And by 21 BCE, for the first time in recorded history, China was united under one central rule. That's when Ying Jing declared something new. He wasn't just a king anymore. He called himself Shi Huangdi, which means first emperor. Not a king of a single region, but the emperor of all under heaven. And suddenly, the world had changed. Let's pause there for a second and really take that in. China had been a land of many, many states, many cultures, many rulers. Now it was one land, one ruler, one emperor. Qin Shi Huang didn't just sit on his throne and enjoy the view though. He wanted control, real control, and to get it he turned the whole empire into a finely tuned machine. He abolished the old feudal system. Gone were the noble families with their own little kingdoms. In their place he divided the empire into provinces, run by officials he personally appointed. These officials weren't allowed to pass power down to their children. That way, loyalty stayed with the emperor, not with family ties. He standardized almost everything: writing, weights and measures, currency, even the width of cart axles, so that roads across the empire would all line up. It might sound small, but think about it. This was like syncing the entire country on the same operating system. Roads, by the way, were another big deal. The Qin built over 4,000 miles of roadways connecting all corners of the empire. This helped soldiers move faster, merchants trade better, and officials travel efficiently. It's like the ancient version of laying down a nationwide internet line, only instead of Wi-Fi you got marching armies. Then came the Great Wall. Now there had been walls before, local barriers built by states to defend against nomads and invaders from the north. But Qin Shi Huang had a different idea. He wanted to link them all into one colossal wall. Something that screamed power, something that would keep the barbarians out and show the world who was boss. It was massive. Hundreds of thousands of laborers, many of them prisoners or conscripted peasants, were sent to the frontiers. The work was backbreaking. Conditions were brutal. Thousands died. And while the original version of the wall wasn't the majestic stone fortress you might imagine today, it was still a monster of an achievement. But while the emperor was building walls and standardizing laws, he was also building fear. Lots of it. See, the Qin legal code was unforgiving, extremely strict, and violations, even minor ones, were punished severely. If one person in a village broke the law, the whole village might be punished. Families were held accountable for each other's behavior. The legalists behind these laws believed that people were naturally selfish and needed hard rules to behave. No exceptions, no leniency. It worked in a way crime dropped and order was kept. But it also made people miserable. And then came one of the darkest moves of all. In 2013 BCE, Emperor's advisors told him that too many books were dangerous. Books meant ideas, and ideas meant dissent. So Qin Shi Huang ordered a book burning. All historical records that didn't align with the official story, burn them. Confucian texts that encouraged rulers to be moral instead of powerful, burn them. The only books that were allowed were technical manuals and legalist documents. And it didn't stop there. Around 460 Confucian scholars were buried alive or executed because they resisted. It was a chilling message. Loyalty to the emperor came before truth, history or philosophy. Meanwhile, Qin Shi Huang wasn't sleeping easy. He was obsessed with death, terrified of it. He sent envoys across the land looking for elixirs of immortality. He drank strange potions. He talked to mystics and alchemists.
And then he built his tomb. Oh boy, the tomb. Located near present-day Xi'an, this wasn't just a burial site. It was a city under the ground. Inside there were rivers made of mercury, ceilings covered in jewels, and palaces crafted in miniature. But the most famous part, the terracotta army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each one different. Different faces, different hairstyles, different weapons. They stood in formation, silently guarding their emperor, ready to protect him in the afterlife. It's one of the most astonishing archaeological finds in the world, and we've only scratched the surface. The actual tomb has never been fully opened. Some say it's too dangerous, others say it's too sacred. But while Qin Shi Huang was preparing for eternity, his empire was falling apart. You see, ruling through fear works, but only for a while. After the emperor died in 21 BCE, things unraveled quickly. His son, Hahai, took the throne thanks to a scheme by a corrupt official named Zhao Gao. But Hahai didn't have his father's vision or strength. He tried to rule with the same iron grip, but it didn't hold. Rebellions exploded across the empire. People were angry, tired, and ready to fight back. The peasant uprisings started in small villages. Then former generals and nobles joined in. And soon the whole empire was on fire. By 2006 BCE, just 4 years after Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty was gone. But don't mistake that for failure. Yes, the Qin dynasty burned bright and fast, like a firework. But what it left behind was massive. It showed China what unification looked like. It created the idea of a central government, of national laws, of one country with one identity. It gave China its first emperor, and that idea would live on for over 2,000 years. So yeah, Qin was harsh, uncompromising, paranoid even. But it wasn't just a dynasty. It was a turning point. And as its ashes cooled, a new force was already rising from the chaos. A man named Liu Bang, once a low-ranking official, would take center stage. He would lead the rebellion that overthrew the Qin, and he would become the first emperor of the Han. But that's a story for another chapter.
So the Qin dynasty had roared into existence, changed the world, and then collapsed just as fast. After all that chaos, brutal laws, massive building projects, and a mountain of rebellions, you might imagine people were exhausted. And you'd be right. The country needed a break. But more than that, it needed a new direction. Someone to pick up the pieces, calm the storm, and maybe, just maybe, rule with a little more heart. Enter Liu Bang. He wasn't born in a palace. He wasn't raised with silver chopsticks or trained in ancient strategy scrolls. He was a regular guy, a peasant, a former low-ranking official who'd once worked as a patrol officer. The kind of person no one expected to shape history. But oh, did he ever? When the Qin dynasty started crumbling, Liu Bang didn't wait around. He raised an army, won key battles, and gradually outmaneuvered everyone else trying to grab power. There was one final showdown with a powerful rival named Shang Yu, a general with charisma, muscles, and a giant army. Liu Bang was the underdog, no doubt about it, but he played it smart. He used strategy, patience, and politics to win. And in the end, in 2020 BCE, he came out on top. That's when he took the throne and became Emperor Gaozu of Han. Just like that, the Han dynasty was born. And this time it wouldn't just be a flash in the pan. The Han lasted for more than 400 years, and they gave China some of its most golden moments. A time of growth, innovation, exploration, and yes, the occasional drama. But overall, the Han dynasty laid the foundation for what many Chinese people still think of as true China. In fact, to this day, the largest ethnic group in China is called the Han Chinese. That's how deep this dynasty's roots go. So, how did they pull it off? How did they go from the ashes of the Qin to centuries of prosperity? Well, let's break it down in a story that flows like a river, steady, winding, and full of little surprises. First, let's talk about the government. Liu Bang was clever. He knew people were still traumatized by the iron grip of the Qin. So instead of continuing that fear-based rule, he softened things up. He brought back Confucianism, the old philosophy that focused on kindness, virtue, family, and harmony. People were like, finally, some decency. Confucianism became the moral backbone of the state. Officials were expected to be role models. Respect your elders, be honest, stay loyal. The Han used these values not just for decoration, but to actually run the empire. It was like the heart and soul of the country. But that didn't mean everything was loosey-goosey. The legalist systems from the Qin still stuck around in some ways. The laws were still there. The government was still highly organized. But the mood had changed. It wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about balance. Now the civil service system, this was a big deal. The Han dynasty started selecting government officials based on merit, not just family background. Imagine being a brilliant kid from a small village, studying hard, and one day becoming a top advisor to the emperor. That kind of social mobility was rare in the ancient world, but the Han made it possible. The exams weren't quite as formalized yet, but the idea was born. If you're smart and virtuous, you can serve. And over time this idea would grow into the famous imperial examination system that lasted all the way to the early 1900s. Economically, the Han were thriving. Agriculture got a boost with new tools, better irrigation systems and policies that helped farmers succeed. Silk production went through the roof. Salt and iron were nationalized, meaning the government controlled them, which brought in lots of money. And let's not forget the Silk Road. Ah, the Silk Road. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale, right? Camels trekking across deserts, caravans packed with treasures, merchants swapping stories under starlit skies. And honestly, that's not too far from the truth. Under the reign of Emperor Wu of Han, more on him in a bit, China officially opened trade routes to the west. This was the real birth of the Silk Road, a network of roads, trails, and ports that stretched from China all the way to Rome. Silk was the superstar, of course, but there were also spices, jade, porcelain, and paper heading west. In return, the Chinese got glassware, horses, and new ideas. Speaking of Emperor Wu, let's dive into his reign. He ruled from 41 to 87 BCE, and he was one of the most powerful and ambitious emperors in Chinese history. He wasn't content with just sitting on the throne. He wanted to expand, to grow the empire, strengthen the military, and make Han China a true superpower. And he did just that. Under his leadership, the Han pushed their borders further than ever before. They fought off the Xingu, the nomadic tribes from the north who were always causing trouble. They took control of new territories in the west and south, including parts of Korea and Vietnam. But all this expansion came at a cost. Wars are expensive, taxes went up. The burden on the common people grew heavier. So while Emperor Wu was building an empire, he was also planting seeds of unrest. Culturally, the Han were shining. They made big advances in science, medicine, and technology. A genius named Zhang Heng invented the seismograph, a device that could detect earthquakes. Another scientist, Hua Tuo, performed surgeries and used herbal medicine in ways that were way ahead of his time. And let's talk about paper. Around 0105 CE, a man named Kai Lun improved the method of making paper from mulberry bark and other plant fibers. This changed everything. Books became easier to produce. Education became more accessible. Knowledge started to spread like wildfire. Art and literature thrived too. Poets, historians, and philosophers wrote about everything from war and politics to love and nature. The great historian Sima Qian wrote the records of the grand historian,
a massive history book that covered everything from the mythical Yellow Emperor to his own time. His work was so respected that it became the model for all Chinese historical writing afterward. But no dynasty lasts forever. As the Han aged, cracks began to form, corruption seeped into the court. Powerful families and eunuchs, yes, eunuchs, castrated men who held political influence began pulling strings behind the scenes. Local landlords grew stronger and started ignoring the central government. The gap between the rich and the poor widened. Peasants were overworked and overtaxed. Discontent began to boil. And then in 1804 CE, it exploded. That's when the Yellow Turban Rebellion broke out, a massive peasant uprising, led by a religious movement promising a new age of peace and equality. The rebels wore yellow scarves around their heads, hence the name. They were crushed, but the rebellion shattered what little unity was left. After that, the Han government was like a sandcastle at high tide. Warlords started carving up the empire for themselves. The court was a mess. Puppet emperors were placed on the throne, and real power slipped away. In 220 CE, the last Han emperor was officially forced to step down. And just like that, the dynasty ended. But what a legacy it left behind. The Han gave China its cultural identity, its bureaucratic backbone, and its global reputation. They opened up the world to trade and diplomacy. They showed that good governance could come from humble beginnings. And they proved that ideas like Confucianism could outlive empires. Even today, people look back on the Han as one of the most glorious periods in Chinese history. And while their time ended, the next chapter would bring a whole new era of heroes, division, and drama. The three kingdoms were on the horizon, but we'll save that storm for the next story.
The end of the Han dynasty was like the crumbling of a great stone temple, each piece falling away slowly, each crack a reminder of how much had been lost. In its place there arose not one unified empire, but three competing states, each vying for power, each with its own dreams of greatness. This was the period known as the Three Kingdoms, a time of war, strategy, and legendary heroes whose names still echo in Chinese history today. It all started in 2020 CE, when the last emperor of the Han dynasty, Emperor Xian, was forced to abdicate. This wasn't a dramatic battle or an assassination. It was more of a political maneuver orchestrated by the cunning warlord Cao Cao. Cao Cao had been the de facto ruler of China for years, using his position to control the court and the emperor himself. But with the abdication, Cao Cao's dream of unifying the country under his rule seemed just a little too far out of reach. His death in 2020 CE marked the official beginning of the Three Kingdoms period. Though the seeds of division had been sown long before, the map of China, once united under the Han, now split into three distinct regions. To the north was the Kingdom of Wei, ruled by Cao Cao's son, Cao Pi. To the south, in the fertile lands around the Yangtze River, was the Kingdom of Wo, led by the charismatic Sun Quan. And to the west, in the mountainous region of Sichuan, was the Kingdom of Shu, founded by the legendary general Liu Bei. These three kingdoms were not just rivals, they were symbols of different ideologies, each representing a different vision for China's future. Let's start with the Wei Kingdom. Wei was the largest and most powerful of the three, controlling the north and much of the central plains. Its leader, Cao Pi, had inherited a kingdom built on the strength of his father's military genius. Cao Pi wasn't a warrior like his father, but he was a skilled politician and a master of manipulation. When he declared himself Emperor of Wei, it wasn't just a declaration of power, it was a message to the world. The Wei Kingdom was here to stay. Cao Pi's reign, however, was marked by constant struggle. Though he had the largest military and the most resources, Wei had to defend its borders on all sides. The Shu Kingdom in the west, led by Liu Bei, was constantly pushing for expansion.
Liu Bei was no ordinary leader. He had become a symbol of the common people's desire for justice and stability. The people of the Shu kingdom saw Liu Bei as the rightful heir to the Han throne, the man who would restore China to its former glory. This gave Liu Bei not just a claim to power, but a moral high ground that made him incredibly popular, especially among the common folk. That it wasn't just his leadership that made Liu Bei so special, it was his friendship with two of the greatest men of the age, Zhuge Liang and Guan Yu. Guan Yu, known for his loyalty and martial prowess, was a hero in his own right, a man whose reputation for courage and honor was legendary. Zhuge Liang, on the other hand, was a brilliant strategist and statesman, a man whose wisdom became the stuff of legends. Together these three men became the core of the Shu kingdom, and its best hope for survival in a world full of rivalries and constant warfare. The Wu kingdom, meanwhile, represented a different kind of power. Wu was led by Sun Quan, the youngest son of the famed Sun Jian, a warlord who had risen to power during the late years of the Han. Unlike Wei and Shu, Wu's strength lay in its geography. The Yangtze River, which ran through the heart of Wu, served as a natural barrier against invasions from the north. Wu's strategy was based on its ability to defend itself while taking advantage of the fertile land and rich resources of the south. Sun Quan's rule was marked by relative stability compared to the constant warfare of the north and west. His kingdom was smaller in size, but it had a strong navy and a loyal army. Wu became known for its skilled generals and its ability to outsmart larger, more powerful enemies. However, none of these kingdoms were truly at peace. The constant struggle for power kept them in a perpetual state of war, and every leader had to navigate not just military threats, but also alliances, betrayals, and internal power struggles. The Three Kingdoms period was as much about diplomacy as it was about warfare, and every decision could have monumental consequences. One of the most famous events of this period was the Battle of Red Cliffs 28 CE, which took place between the forces of Cao Cao and the alliance of Sun Quan and Liu Bei. Cao Cao had amassed a massive army and was marching south to crush Wu and Shu once and for all. However, the southern forces were led by the brilliant strategist Zhuge Liang, from Shu and Sun Quan's general Zhao Yu. The two generals were not just allies but close friends, and they used their combined knowledge of both land and sea to devastating effect. The battle was a decisive victory for Wu and Shu, effectively halting Cao Cao's advance into the south. This battle is still celebrated as a moment of brilliant strategy and daring, and it ensured that the Three Kingdoms would remain in play for decades to come. As time went on, the Three Kingdoms continued to evolve. The shifting alliances and betrayals were as unpredictable as ever. Cao Cao's descendants would continue to rule Wei for several generations, but the kingdom would slowly lose its grip on power. Meanwhile, Liu Bei passed away in 23 CE, leaving the kingdom of Shu in the hands of his son Liu Shan, who was a much weaker ruler. It was Zhuge Liang, his chief strategist, who tried to hold the kingdom together through several military campaigns known as the Northern Expeditions. However, these efforts ultimately failed, and the Shu kingdom began to weaken. In Wu, Sun Quan ruled for much of the period, and his leadership helped stabilize the southern kingdom for several decades. But after his death in 2052 CE, his heirs struggled to maintain power. Despite its early strength, Wu too began to see internal struggles and was eventually absorbed into the Jin dynasty in 2080 CE, marking the official end of the Three Kingdoms period. The Three Kingdoms era, though, left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. It's a time still celebrated in literature, art, and film. The novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written during the 14th century by Liu Guanzhong, immortalized this period in Chinese history, mixing fact and fiction to create a captivating story that has influenced generations of Chinese and beyond. The characters of Liu Bei, Sun Quan, Cao Cao, Zhuge Liang, Guan Yu and many others have become larger-than-life figures representing ideals like loyalty, wisdom, and ambition. Though the Three Kingdoms period was short, its impact on Chinese history was profound. It set the stage for the reunification of China under the Jin dynasty, but it also shaped China's culture, politics, and military strategy for centuries to come. The stories of the Three Kingdoms continue to captivate people, not just because of the battles and drama, but because of the larger themes of human ambition, loyalty, and the pursuit of power. In the end, the Three Kingdoms period wasn't just about who won or who lost, it was about the legacy they left behind. The Three Kingdoms were a moment in time, a flash of brilliance and blood, but they became a permanent part of the Chinese consciousness, a symbol of an era where the gods of war roamed the earth, and history was made in the heat of battle.
The world had changed dramatically by the time the Three Kingdoms period came to an end. It wasn't just the land that had been divided, it was the very idea of China itself. After decades of warfare, alliances, and betrayals, the people had grown weary, their hopes for unity shattered in the fires of battle. But history, as it always does, moved forward. In 2080 CE, the Jin dynasty emerged from the ashes of the Three Kingdoms, not through military conquest alone, but through political maneuvering and careful consolidation of power. The rise of the Jin dynasty was, in many ways, the culmination of a centuries-long process of change in China. Following the collapse of the Wei Kingdom, the Jin dynasty's foundation rested on the shoulders of the Sima family, whose political ambitions had been quietly growing for years. Sima Yi, a general and strategist who had served the Wei, was the key figure behind this rise. Though he initially served under Wei's emperors, Sima Yi's ambition led him to seize control of the government in 2049 CE through a combination of intelligence, diplomacy, and sheer force of will. By 2060 CE, Sima Yi's son, Sima Zhao, had taken control of the Wei court, and in 2065 CE, Sima Yan, Sima Zhao's son, declared himself emperor of the new Jin dynasty, marking the official end of the Wei. The Jin dynasty, however, did not have the luxury of peace that the Han once enjoyed. Even though the Jin dynasty united China for a time, the empire was still plagued by internal strife and the ever-present threat of rebellion. The biggest challenge facing the new dynasty was the 16 Kingdoms, a loose collection of nomadic tribes and military states that had sprung up in the northern part of China after the fall of the Han and the disintegration of the Wei. These kingdoms, while not as large or as organized as the great Han or Jin empires, were powerful in their own right, and their leaders had ambitions that reached far beyond their small territories. The 16 Kingdoms were not one united force. Instead, they were a collection of rival states, each with its own leader and army, constantly at war with each other. This chaos in the north would become one of the defining features of the early Jin dynasty, and the Jin's efforts to conquer the north were fraught with difficulty. The north, ruled by various Sakyong-gu, Chakyond, and Xiaokmei peoples, was culturally and politically different from the more traditional Chinese states in the south. These northern tribes had different ways of life, different religions, and different political systems, making it difficult for the Jin to maintain control once they expanded into these territories. The first major challenge to the Jin came from a group known as the Sakyong-gu, who had long been a thorn in China's side. The Sakyong-gu were a nomadic people originally from the steppes of northern China, and they had been a constant threat to the Han dynasty, even before its collapse. Under the leadership of Liu Yuan, the Sakyong-gu formed their own kingdom, Hanzhou, in the late 300s. Hanzhou was one of the most powerful of the 16 kingdoms. Its territory stretched across much of northern China. While the Jin dynasty was consolidating power in the south, Hanzhou was expanding, seeking to unite the northern territories under one banner. The Jin had to face not only external threats like the Xiaokmei, but also a rapidly decaying internal structure.
The Jin's ability to govern its vast empire was limited by the same problems that plagued the later Han: infighting, corruption, and a lack of strong leadership. Even though the Jin's early emperors had been able to bring the country together, they lacked the ability to keep it unified for long. The Wu Hu Rebellion of 436 CE, led by a coalition of nomadic tribes in the north, further weakened the Jin. The rebellion was not just a military conflict, it was also a challenge to the very legitimacy of the Jin dynasty, forcing the ruling family to contend with the idea that their empire might never truly reunite the north and south. In the face of such instability, the Jin rulers sought to preserve their dynasty by making alliances and diplomatic efforts with the smaller states of the 16 kingdoms. However, the sheer number of these states, each with its own ambitions and cultural identity, made any sort of lasting peace difficult. By the early 4th century, the Jin began to expand northward, pushing into the lands controlled by the 16 kingdoms. They succeeded in defeating some of the smaller kingdoms, but the process was slow and costly. While the Jin were embroiled in their northern campaigns, another important factor in the empire's history was the increasing role of Buddhism in China. The religion had been introduced to China from India during the Han dynasty, but it wasn't until the Jin period that Buddhism began to gain significant traction. Buddhist monasteries became influential centers of learning, culture, and political power. The rise of Buddhism also coincided with the increasing influence of the Taoist religious movement, which had long been part of Chinese culture, but began to merge with Buddhist ideas during this period. As the Jin dynasty struggled to maintain its grip on the empire, religious leaders, both Buddhist and Taoist, played an important role in shaping the social and political landscape of China. Despite these efforts, the Jin dynasty's reign over the unified empire did not last. The weakness of the central government and the empire's inability to stabilize the north led to its eventual collapse. In 316 CE, the capital city of Luoyang was sacked by the Shakno forces, marking the beginning of the decline of the Jin dynasty. The Jin were eventually split into two states, the Eastern Jin in the south and the Western Jin in the north. These two states were never able to fully reunite China, and they were ultimately defeated by the increasing power of the Northern Wei, a new kingdom formed by the Shakno people in the north. The end of the Jin dynasty was not the end of China's troubles. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new period of division and chaos, as the 16 kingdoms continued to exist in the north, while the south was left to rebuild after the fall of the Jin. This period of division lasted until the Sui dynasty rose to power in 59 CE, reuniting China once again. In the end, the Jin dynasty and the 16 kingdoms represent a time of profound change and transition in Chinese history. Though the Jin were able to unite much of the country for a time, the empire was never able to fully stabilize, and its influence waned as new powers emerged in the north. The legacy of the 16 kingdoms, however, lived on in the fractured nature of the Chinese landscape. The rise and fall of these small kingdoms would lay the groundwork for the reunification of China under the Sui dynasty and later the Tang dynasty, which would lead China into a new era of prosperity and cultural flourishing. But for now, the legacy of the Jin dynasty and the 16 kingdoms was one of ambition and struggle, a reminder of how fragile peace can be and how quickly the winds of change can shift. In the end, the period of the 16 kingdoms, with all its chaos and conflict, would become a foundational chapter in the long and tumultuous history of China.
After decades of turmoil and disunity, a new hope began to rise on the horizon of China. It was in the early 6th century when the winds of change first stirred the land once more, bringing an end to the fragmentation of China. The Sui dynasty, although short-lived, was the spark that reignited the unification of China and set the stage for one of the most prosperous periods in Chinese history, the Tang dynasty. The Sui dynasty's emergence came at a time when the country was still divided and fragmented. The Northern Wei, which had been established by the Xianbei people in the north, eventually evolved into the northern Zhou in the 6th century. Meanwhile, the southern regions, still ruled by the southern dynasties, had been struggling to stabilize and reunify China. It was into this fractured world that the Sui dynasty emerged, led by Yang Jian, a man who would later take the imperial name Emperor Wen of Sui. Emperor Wen, whose rise to power was nothing short of extraordinary, was born into a noble family in the northern court of the northern Zhou. Through a combination of strategic marriages, political acumen, and a series of well-timed military actions, Yang Jian was able to seize control of the northern Zhou, ultimately founding the Sui dynasty in 581 CE. It wasn't long before Emperor Wen turned his attention to the south, where the southern Chen dynasty ruled. After a series of successful military campaigns, the Sui finally reunified China in 589 CE, ending nearly 3 centuries of division. While Emperor Wen's military prowess and political vision were impressive, his greatest achievement was perhaps the Grand Canal, a monumental engineering project that connected the Yellow River in the north to the Yangtze River in the south. The Grand Canal facilitated the movement of goods, people and military forces between the north and south, solidifying the Sui dynasty's grip on power and laying the groundwork for future prosperity. Despite these early successes, however, the Sui dynasty was short-lived. By the time Emperor Wen passed away in 604 CE, his son, Emperor Yang, took the throne. Emperor Yang, unlike his father, was marked by his ambitious and sometimes reckless nature. He continued his father's projects but at an unsustainable pace. One of his most ambitious projects was the expansion of the Grand Canal, which led to the forced labor of thousands of workers. The resulting strain on the economy, along with the pressures of continued military campaigns against the northern Turks and the Khitans, began to wear on the people. By 618 CE, the Sui dynasty collapsed under the weight of its internal rebellions and external threats. However, the collapse of the Sui dynasty paved the way for a new dynasty, the Tang dynasty, which would become one of the most prosperous and culturally vibrant periods in Chinese history. The Tang dynasty was founded by Li Yuan, a general who had served under the Sui. Li Yuan's rise to power was driven by a combination of his military success and his ability to navigate the political chaos that followed the Sui's fall. In 618 CE, Li Yuan declared himself emperor and founded the Tang dynasty, marking the beginning of a new era for China. Under the Tang, China saw a remarkable period of consolidation, reform, and cultural flourishing. The Tang emperors, beginning with Emperor Gaozu, implemented sweeping reforms that strengthened the central government and improved the economy. The equal field system, which allocated land to peasants based on family size and the ability to work the land, ensured that the empire's agricultural output was maximized. The establishment of a centralized bureaucracy staffed by educated officials helped to stabilize the empire and improve governance. One of the most significant features of the Tang dynasty was its embrace of Buddhism. While Buddhism had been introduced to China long before the Tang, it was during this period that it truly flourished. The Tang emperors were generally tolerant of different religions, and Buddhism became deeply intertwined with Chinese culture. Buddhist temples were constructed across the empire and the faith gained widespread support among the people. However, the spread of Buddhism also faced opposition from Confucian scholars and Taoist priests, who felt threatened by its influence. Despite this, Buddhism continued to thrive during the early years of the Tang dynasty. The Tang period was also marked by significant artistic and cultural achievements. The Tang poetry tradition, which included poets like Li Bai and Du Fu, is considered one of the greatest periods of Chinese literature. The Tang emperors were patrons of the arts, and the empire became a cultural center, attracting artists, scholars, and travelers from across Asia. The Silk Road, which had long been a conduit for trade between China and the West, was also revitalized during the Tang dynasty, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures.
At its height, the Tang dynasty was a global power. Its capital, Chang, modern-day Xi'an, was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, a hub of commerce, culture, and diplomacy. The Tang Empire's influence stretched far beyond its borders, as it established relations with Korea, Japan, India, and Central Asia. The Tang military was formidable, and it was able to maintain control over vast territories, from the Korean peninsula in the east to the borders of the Persian Empire in the west. Despite its successes, the Tang dynasty was not without its challenges. The empire faced internal strife and corruption, particularly in the later years of the dynasty. The Lushan Rebellion 755–763 CE was one of the most devastating events in Tang history. Led by a general named Lushan, the rebellion weakened the Tang government and resulted in massive loss of life. Though the Tang eventually quelled the rebellion, the empire was never the same afterward. The central government grew weaker, and the power of regional military governors called jidushi increased, leading to a gradual decline in the central authority of the emperor. Over time, the Tang dynasty's control over China began to erode. By the mid-9th century, the dynasty was in steep decline. Rebellions, famines, and corruption continued to plague the empire. In 907 CE, the Tang dynasty came to a dramatic end when the last emperor, Emperor Ai, was forced to abdicate, and the dynasty was replaced by the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a time of political fragmentation and instability that lasted until the rise of the Song dynasty. But despite its eventual collapse, the Tang dynasty's legacy endured. The political, cultural, and artistic achievements of the Tang period continued to influence China for centuries to come. The Tang emperor's embrace of a cosmopolitan, multicultural world laid the foundation for China's future role as a global power. The Silk Road continued to be a vital trade route, and the cultural exchanges between China and the rest of Asia during the Tang period paved the way for the spread of Chinese culture, philosophy, and technology to the farthest reaches of the continent. In the end, the Tang dynasty's story is one of triumph and tragedy, of a brilliant civilization that rose to greatness, only to falter in the face of internal division and external threats. Yet its legacy lives on in the achievements of the people, the art, the literature, and the culture that flourished during its reign. The Sui dynasty, though short, was the necessary prelude to the rise of the Tang, and the Tang dynasty set the stage for the next great chapter in Chinese history. After the decline of the mighty Tang dynasty, China entered a period of fragmentation and confusion, marked by constant warfare and shifting alliances. But as with all periods of turmoil, there came a time for renewal, a time for new ideas and the revival of the Chinese spirit. This time arrived with the Song dynasty, a dynasty that would last for over 3 centuries and leave a profound mark on the cultural and intellectual landscape of China. The Song dynasty's rise was not one of grand military conquests or imperial expansion. Instead, it was a dynasty built on a foundation of intellect, technological innovation, and the exploration of new philosophical ideas. The Song dynasty officially began in 960 CE, when a general named Zhao Kuangyin ascended the throne as Emperor Taizu. Zhao, who had served as a military leader during the turbulent period following the fall of the Tang, recognized that China's future lay not in further military expansion, but in stability and internal development. With a sharp political mind, he consolidated power, defeated rival warlords, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of China's most economically advanced periods in history. The Song were not, however, able to achieve the same level of territorial control as the earlier dynasties like the Tang. While they ruled over most of China, their reign was marked by a division between the northern and southern parts of the empire. The northern Song dynasty, with its capital at Kaifeng, ruled from 960 CE to 1127 CE. During this period, the Song experienced significant economic growth and urbanization. Their technological innovations,
such as the invention of printing and the use of gunpowder in warfare, were groundbreaking. But despite these advancements, the Song were unable to hold off the growing threat from the Jurchen people who formed the Jin dynasty in the north. In 1127 CE, the Jin conquered Kaifeng, leading to the fall of the northern Song dynasty. However, the fall of Kaifeng did not mark the end of the Song dynasty. In the south, a branch of the Song dynasty managed to regroup and re-establish the empire under the name of the Southern Song dynasty. With its new capital at Hangzhou, the Southern Song continued to rule over much of China until 1279 CE, when they were finally conquered by the Mongols. Despite their territorial losses, the Southern Song dynasty was a period of remarkable cultural and economic flourishing. The city of Hangzhou became one of the most populous and prosperous cities in the world, known for its vibrant markets, beautiful canals, and thriving arts scene. The Southern Song dynasty in many ways epitomized the intellectual and cultural golden age of medieval China. It was during this period that Neo-Confucianism began to rise to prominence, shaping Chinese thought for centuries to come. The Song dynasty had inherited a China that had already experienced the profound influence of Confucianism, which had been the dominant philosophical tradition in China for centuries. Confucianism, with its emphasis on social order, morality, and education, had already shaped the foundation of Chinese society. But the Song were the ones who truly refined and redefined it. The heart of Neo-Confucianism was a desire to reconcile Confucian ideas with elements of Taoism and Buddhism, two foreign philosophies that had deeply influenced Chinese thought. While Confucianism focused on practical morality and the importance of family and government, Taoism and Buddhism introduced more mystical elements, focusing on the pursuit of inner peace, spiritual enlightenment, and the nature of existence. Neo-Confucian thinkers sought to bring these various ideas together into a cohesive worldview, one that would address both the material world and the spiritual realm. The most influential of these Neo-Confucian scholars was Zhu Xi, a philosopher and educator who lived during the Southern Song period. Zhu Xi's interpretation of Confucianism emphasized the importance of self-cultivation, the study of the classics, and the pursuit of moral perfection. Zhu Xi's ideas gained widespread acceptance and became the orthodox philosophy of the Song dynasty. His thoughts were so influential that they would continue to shape Chinese education, government, and society for over 1,000 years. Neo-Confucianism, under the guidance of Zhu Xi and his followers, became the intellectual backbone of China's ruling elite, especially in the civil service exams, which became the primary method for selecting government officials. In addition to its intellectual achievements, the Song dynasty was also a period of extraordinary technological and artistic innovation. The Song were pioneers in fields like printing, papermaking, compass navigation, and gunpowder weaponry. The invention of movable type printing by Bai Sheng in the 11th century revolutionized the spread of knowledge, making books more affordable and accessible. This, in turn, facilitated the spread of education, science, and culture throughout China, making the Song one of the most literate societies in the world at the time. Gunpowder, which had been used for fireworks, was increasingly adapted for military purposes during the Song period. The Song army used gunpowder in the form of rockets, fire lances, and early cannons, giving them an edge in warfare. While the Song were unable to prevent the Mongols from eventually conquering China, these innovations were not forgotten and were later adopted by other cultures across the globe. The arts also flourished during the Song dynasty, particularly in the fields of painting, calligraphy, and ceramics. The Song are often considered the golden age of Chinese painting, with landscape painting becoming one of the most important genres of the time. Artists like Fan Quan and Zhang Ziduan captured the beauty of nature and the human experience in breathtaking detail. Song ceramics, particularly the delicate porcelain from Jingdezhen, became highly prized and were exported around the world. Despite all these achievements, the Song dynasty was far from immune to the pressures of history. The threat from the Jin dynasty in the north was just the beginning of a long series of invasions and internal strife.
The Mongols under Genghis Khan and later his grandson Kublai Khan would eventually invade China, and in 1229 CE, the Song dynasty came to an end, marking the beginning of the Yuan dynasty, the first foreign-led dynasty in China's history. However, even in its decline, the Song dynasty's legacy lived on. The technological advances, cultural achievements, and intellectual innovations of the Song laid the foundation for the future of China. The rise of Neo-Confucianism during this period would continue to shape Chinese thought for centuries, and the civil service exams, which had become the standard for selecting government officials during the Song, would remain in place until the early 20th century. The Song dynasty in many ways represented the pinnacle of Chinese civilization in terms of culture, science, and philosophy. While it may have been brought low by external threats, its intellectual and cultural contributions had a lasting impact on Chinese society and the wider world. It was a dynasty that brought together the past and the future, blending ancient traditions with new innovations and setting the stage for the future of China.
The Song dynasty had been a beacon of cultural, intellectual, and technological achievement, but its downfall marked the end of an era in Chinese history. The land was left vulnerable, fragmented, and ripe for conquest. It was not from within China's borders that the new rulers would emerge, but from the far steppes of Mongolia. In the early 13th century, a fierce and visionary leader named Genghis Khan would rise to power, forging an empire that stretched across Asia and eventually sweeping into China, forever changing the course of its history. Genghis Khan, born as Temujin in 1162 CE, had a tumultuous early life. Raised in the harsh environment of the Mongolian steppes, he experienced betrayal, hardship, and loss. After his father's death, his family was abandoned by their clan, and Temujin spent much of his early years in poverty. However, through sheer determination, military brilliance, and the ability to unite various Mongol tribes, Temujin eventually rose to power. By 102 CE, he had united the Mongol tribes and declared himself Genghis Khan, which means universal ruler. Genghis Khan's success was due not only to his military genius, but also to his innovative leadership. He reorganized the Mongol army, creating a highly disciplined, mobile, and effective force. Genghis Khan's military strategy was built around speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. He employed a system of feigned retreats, where his troops would appear to flee in order to lure enemies into traps, only to turn around and strike decisively. Genghis Khan was also a brilliant tactician, known for his ability to adapt and innovate in the heat of battle. Under his leadership, the Mongols conquered vast territories, including Persia, Central Asia, and Russia, but it was in China that Genghis Khan would face his greatest challenge. The Song dynasty had already been weakened by internal divisions, and the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China, was also ripe for conquest. In 1215 CE, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jin dynasty, launching a series of campaigns that ultimately led to the fall of the Jin in 1234 CE. With northern China under his control, Genghis Khan's successors turned their attention to the southern Song. The conquest of the Song would be the final step in the Mongols' dominance over China, and it would lay the foundation for the Yuan dynasty, the first foreign-led dynasty in China's history. Upon Genghis Khan's death in 1227 CE, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, but his legacy of Mongol expansion lived on. His grandson Kublai Khan would be the one to fulfill his grandfather's dream of ruling over all of China. Kublai Khan, unlike many of his Mongol predecessors, recognized that to rule China effectively, he would need to adapt to Chinese culture and governance. In 1260 CEE, Kublai Khan proclaimed himself the Emperor of China, founding the Yuan dynasty, and he established Dedu, modern-day Beijing, as the capital of his empire.
The establishment of the Yuan dynasty in 1271 CE marked a dramatic shift in Chinese history. For the first time, China was ruled by non-Chinese rulers, and the Mongol presence would be felt in every corner of the empire. Despite being conquerors, the Mongols were pragmatic rulers, and Kublai Khan sought to integrate the vast and diverse cultures of China into his empire. He adopted many elements of Chinese governance, including the Confucian bureaucracy, and he welcomed Chinese scholars and officials into his administration. However, the Mongols maintained a hierarchical society, with Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians and other foreigners, and then the native Chinese population at the bottom. Kublai Khan's reign is often seen as a period of cultural exchange and economic prosperity. Under the Yuan, trade flourished along the Silk Road, and China became a center of international commerce. The Mongols encouraged travel and exploration, and this era saw the arrival of famous figures such as Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer, who traveled to the court of Kublai Khan and wrote about his experiences in his book, The Travels of Marco Polo. Polo's accounts introduced Europe to the wealth and splendor of China, sparking curiosity and trade between the East and West. During the Yuan dynasty, China also saw significant advancements in technology and science. The Mongols supported the development of engineering projects, including the improvement of infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and canals. The Grand Canal, which had been started under the Sui and expanded under the Tang, was further developed during the Yuan period, facilitating trade and the movement of goods. In addition, the Mongols encouraged the spread of paper money, which was a relatively new invention at the time. The use of paper currency allowed for more efficient trade and commerce, and was a significant step toward the global economy we know today. However, despite the economic prosperity and cultural achievements, the Yuan dynasty faced significant challenges. The Mongol rulers, who were not native to China, often struggled to fully win the loyalty of the Chinese people. The hierarchical nature of Yuan society, which placed Mongols above all others, led to social tensions and resentment among the Chinese population. The native Chinese, who had long been accustomed to being at the top of the social order, were often treated as second-class citizens under Mongol rule. In addition, the Mongol rulers' failure to fully integrate into Chinese culture created a sense of disconnection between the rulers and the ruled. Moreover, the Yuan dynasty faced economic difficulties in the later years of its rule. Heavy taxation, corruption, and mismanagement led to widespread poverty and famine. These problems were exacerbated by natural disasters, such as floods and droughts, which caused significant damage to agriculture. The discontent among the population eventually led to widespread rebellions and uprisings, which weakened the Yuan government. In the 14th century, a series of devastating rebellions, led by the Red Turban Army, began to gain traction across China. These rebellions, fueled by poverty, hunger, and resentment toward Mongol rule, eventually led to the collapse of the Yuan dynasty. In 1368 CE, the Ming dynasty was established by Zhou Yuanzhang, a former peasant who had risen to power through military campaigns. The fall of the Yuan marked the end of Mongol rule in China and the return of native Chinese control. Despite the eventual collapse of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols' legacy in China was profound. The Yuan dynasty's impact on Chinese society, economy, and culture was lasting. The Mongol-led dynasty introduced new ways of governance, fostered international trade and cultural exchange, and left behind a legacy of innovation in various fields. The Yuan dynasty may have been short-lived, but its influence on China and the world continued to be felt long after its fall.
After the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty fell, China found itself at a crossroads. For over a century, the Mongols had ruled, and the country had experienced a vast cultural and political shift. Now, with the Mongols gone, the Chinese people sought to reclaim their heritage and rebuild the empire under native rule. Enter the Ming dynasty, one of China's most influential and prosperous periods, spanning from 3068 CE to 1644 CE. The Ming era would be defined by an era of cultural renaissance, economic growth, and unprecedented exploration. The foundation of the Ming dynasty was laid by Zhou Yuanzhang, a man whose rise from poverty to power was nothing short of extraordinary. Born in 1328 CE to a poor peasant family in the southern part of China, Zhu's early life was marked by hardship, famine, and the death of his parents. As a young man, he joined the Red Turban Army, a rebel group that had been fighting against the Yuan dynasty. Over time, Zhu proved himself to be a brilliant strategist and a charismatic leader. By 1368 CE, after a series of military victories, he overthrew the Yuan rulers and declared himself Emperor Hongwu, marking the start of the Ming dynasty. The early years of the Ming dynasty were marked by a strong sense of renewal and reform. One of Zhu Yuanzhang's first actions as emperor was to restore Chinese traditions, Confucian values. He sought to centralize power, strengthen the emperor's authority, and re-establish order after the chaos of the Yuan period. The emperor implemented sweeping reforms in government, education, and agriculture, all with the goal of stabilizing the country and promoting prosperity. The Ming emperors were not just concerned with internal affairs, they also focused on restoring China's prestige on the world stage. The early Ming period saw a resurgence in the Confucian bureaucracy, and the civil service exams, which had been revived under the Song dynasty, became the primary method for selecting government officials. These exams ensured that the government was run by scholars and educated individuals, rather than by military leaders or nobles, maintaining the Confucian ideal that the state should be governed by those with moral integrity and wisdom. While the Ming dynasty was committed to consolidating power at home, it also turned its attention outward, particularly during the reign of Emperor Yongle, ruling from 1402 to 1424 CE. Emperor Yongle, one of the most ambitious and energetic of the Ming rulers, sought to make China a dominant power on the world stage. He was determined to expand China's influence, not just through trade, but through diplomacy and military might. His reign saw the commissioning of one of the most extraordinary naval ventures in history, the voyages of Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He, originally named Zheng He Ma, was a Muslim eunuch who had been captured as a child by the Ming forces. Despite his humble beginnings, Zheng He quickly rose to power in the Ming court, thanks to his loyalty, military prowess, and exceptional leadership skills. During Emperor Yongle's reign, Zheng He was appointed to lead a series of diplomatic and trade missions to regions across the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and even as far as the coasts of East Africa. Between 1405 and 1433 CE, Zheng He commanded a fleet of large ships, known as treasure ships, which were some of the largest wooden vessels ever built at the time. These expeditions were remarkable not only for their size but also for their purpose. Zheng He's voyages were meant to establish Chinese dominance in international trade, foster diplomatic relationships, and bring tribute from foreign lands. Zheng He's fleet visited places like Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the Swahili coast of Africa, carrying goods, knowledge, and ideas between China and the wider world. The Ming treasure ships were a symbol of China's naval superiority, and Zheng He's voyages were a testament to China's willingness to engage with the world. During his voyages, Zheng He was warmly received in many of the places he visited. He brought back exotic goods and rare items to China, further fueling the country's economic prosperity. These missions also strengthened China's political influence, as foreign rulers sought to establish tributary relationships with the Ming court. However, despite the success of these voyages, the Chinese government gradually grew more inward-looking after Emperor Yongle's death. Later emperors, particularly after the 1430s, became increasingly wary of foreign influence and abandoned the costly naval expeditions. As a result, China's overseas expansion came to an abrupt end,
and Zheng He's voyages were largely forgotten in the centuries that followed. While the Ming dynasty was characterized by its remarkable explorations and trade, it also experienced significant achievements in the realms of culture and technology. The period saw the revival of Chinese arts and craftsmanship, including the production of Ming porcelain, which became highly prized across the world. The distinctive blue and white porcelain, decorated with intricate designs, was exported to countries as far away as Europe and the Middle East. The Ming dynasty also saw a resurgence in literature and philosophy, with a renewed emphasis on Confucian values and moral teachings. In addition to the arts, the Ming dynasty was also an era of technological innovation. The period saw advancements in engineering, including the construction of the Great Wall of China, which was expanded and strengthened during the Ming period to protect the northern borders from invasions. The Ming also saw improvements in agriculture, with the introduction of new crops and the expansion of irrigation systems, which led to increased food production and population growth. The printing press also continued to evolve during the Ming era, with new printing techniques that allowed for the mass production of books and documents, further spreading education and literacy across China. Despite these remarkable achievements, the Ming dynasty faced challenges, particularly in its later years. After the reign of Emperor Yongle, the dynasty's focus shifted away from exploration and expansion, and the empire became more insular. The court grew increasingly corrupt, and the central government's ability to control the empire weakened. Economic problems, such as inflation and widespread poverty, exacerbated the growing dissatisfaction among the Chinese people. As a result, the Ming dynasty faced multiple uprisings, most notably the Lezhecheng Rebellion, which eventually led to the fall of the Ming in 1644 CE. The fall of the Ming dynasty marked the end of an era of Chinese dominance in global exploration and trade. It also set the stage for the rise of the Qin dynasty, which would rule China for the next 68 years. Despite its decline, the Ming dynasty left a lasting legacy on Chinese society and the world. Its achievements in art, literature, philosophy and exploration helped shape China's place in history and continue to influence the country to this day. The Ming dynasty was a period of both triumph and decline, a time when China's imperial power reached new heights, only to face internal collapse. Yet even in its final years, the Ming dynasty's impact on the world remained undeniable. It was an era of discovery, innovation and cultural flourishing, and its legacy continues to resonate throughout the history of China and beyond.
The fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644 CE marked the end of one of the most glorious chapters in Chinese history, but it was not the end of China's imperial rule. A new dynasty, the Qing dynasty, would rise to take its place, and under its rule, China would experience both great expansion and profound transformation. The Qing dynasty, which lasted from 1644 CE to 1912 CE, would become the last imperial dynasty of China, and its legacy would shape the country's history for centuries to come. The Qing dynasty's origins lay in the Manchu people, a group from the northeastern region of China, near the Great Wall. The Manchus were originally a nomadic people, similar to the Mongols, but over time, they had settled and built a powerful kingdom known as the Jin dynasty. In the early 17th century, the Manchus, led by their charismatic leader, Nurhaci, began to expand their territory, eventually forming a formidable military force. By the time the Ming dynasty was weakened by internal strife and rebellion, the Manchus saw an opportunity to expand their influence. In 1644 CE, the Ming dynasty was on the brink of collapse. Widespread corruption, economic difficulties, and peasant uprisings had weakened the central government, and the empire was falling into chaos. In the midst of this turmoil, a group of rebel forces, led by Li Zicheng, managed to capture the Ming capital, Beijing. The last Ming emperor, Emperor Chongzhen, committed suicide in the face of the rebellion, and the city fell into the hands of the rebels. However, the Manchus, who had been patiently waiting for the right moment to seize power, were quick to act. With the blessing of the remaining Ming loyalists, the Manchu forces entered Beijing and defeated the rebels, claiming the city as their own. This marked the beginning of the Qing dynasty. The first Qing emperor, Emperor Shunji, was only a child when he ascended the throne, but the real power lay in the hands of the regents, who were appointed by the Manchu court. The Qing rulers quickly established their authority over China by consolidating power and winning the loyalty of the population. The Manchus, despite being foreigners, understood the importance of adopting Chinese customs and governance to maintain control. They took on Chinese titles, married Chinese women, and maintained the Confucian bureaucracy that had been central to Chinese governance for centuries. The early Qing emperors, especially Emperor Kangxi, ruling from 1661 to 1722 CE, and Emperor Qianlong, ruling from 1735 to 1796 CE, are often regarded as some of the greatest rulers in Chinese history. Kangxi, one of the longest reigning emperors in Chinese history, was a brilliant military strategist, a patron of the arts, and a devout Confucian. Under his rule, the Qing dynasty expanded its territory significantly, including the conquest of Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. Kangxi was also known for his efforts to consolidate power and eliminate corruption within the government, and his reign brought relative stability and prosperity to China. Kangxi's successor, Emperor Yongzheng, continued his father's policies and focused on centralizing authority. While his reign was marked by strict governance and harsh measures to root out corruption, it also brought economic growth and stability. However, it was Emperor Qianlong who would be the most famous and influential of the Qing emperors. Under Qianlong, China reached the height of its imperial power, becoming the most populous and wealthiest country in the world. Qianlong's reign saw the expansion of China's borders, the flourishing of arts and culture, and the strengthening of China's economy. Yet, despite these achievements, Qianlong's later years were marked by a growing sense of complacency, and his successors would not be able to maintain the stability that the early Qing emperors had established. At its peak, the Qing dynasty controlled a vast territory that included not only China proper, but also regions like Mongolia, Manchuria, and Tibet. The empire's vast size allowed for an impressive agricultural and economic base, and it was during this time that China's population grew to over 300 million people, making it the most populous nation on earth. China's economy was largely based on agriculture, with rice and wheat being the primary crops. The silk trade, which had been vital to China's economy since the Tang dynasty, continued to thrive, as did the production of porcelain and tea. Despite the wealth and prosperity of the Qing dynasty, there were significant challenges that would eventually lead to its downfall. By the late 18th century, the Qing government began to face growing internal unrest. The population had grown too large for the agricultural system to sustain, leading to widespread famine and poverty. Additionally, the Qing emperors had become more isolated and less capable of responding to the needs of their people. The opium trade, which had been introduced by the British in the early 19th century, further exacerbated the situation, leading to widespread addiction and economic instability. The First Opium War, 1839–1842, marked a significant turning point in Qing history. The British had been trading opium for Chinese goods, and when the Chinese government, under the leadership of Emperor Dao Wang, attempted to suppress the opium trade, it led to conflict. The British, with their superior naval power, defeated the Chinese forces and forced the Qing government to sign the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, which opened several Chinese ports to foreign trade and ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain. This event marked the beginning of the century of humiliation,
a period of foreign domination and internal strife that would last until the early 20th century. The Second Opium War, 1856–1860, followed soon after, further weakening the Qing dynasty and leading to more concessions to foreign powers. The Treaty of Tientsin, 1858, and the Treaty of Peking, 1860, forced China to allow foreign missionaries, diplomats, and merchants greater access to Chinese territory. This growing foreign presence, combined with widespread corruption and mismanagement within the Qing government, led to a series of rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850–1864, was the most devastating of these uprisings. Led by Hong Xiuquan, a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the Taiping forces captured large parts of southern China and fought a brutal war against the Qing government. The rebellion resulted in the deaths of millions of people, and it weakened the Qing dynasty further. Although the Taiping forces were eventually defeated, the rebellion left China deeply scarred. In the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty faced additional challenges, including the Boxer Rebellion, 1899–1901, in which Chinese nationalists sought to expel foreign influence from the country. The Qing government's failure to modernize and respond to these growing challenges led to widespread discontent. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 finally ended the Qing dynasty, marking the end of over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. The last emperor, Puyi, abdicated, and China transitioned into a republic. Despite its eventual collapse, the Qing dynasty played a crucial role in shaping modern China. It was under the Qing that China expanded its borders to their greatest extent, becoming a vast empire that included many different ethnic groups and regions. While the Qing rulers were often foreign in origin, they embraced Chinese culture and traditions, ensuring that their rule was seen as legitimate by the people. The legacy of the Qing dynasty is complex, as it represents both a time of great power and prosperity, as well as an era of decline and foreign humiliation. But in the end, the Qing dynasty's story is one of China's longest and most consequential imperial eras, and its impact continues to be felt in the country today.
China's history spans thousands of years, beginning with the earliest settlements along the Yellow River around 2000 BCE. The first major dynasty, the Xia, laid the foundations of Chinese civilization, though much of their history remains mythological. The Shang dynasty followed and was known for its advanced bronze technology, writing system, and powerful kings. The Shao dynasty came next, during which China saw the rise of Confucianism and Taoism, two philosophies that continue to shape Chinese culture today. The Qing dynasty in 2021 BCE is notable for unifying China under the rule of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who standardized writing, measurements, and currency, and built the Great Wall of China. The Han dynasty, lasting from 26 BCE to 2020 CE, expanded the empire, creating the Silk Road and spreading Chinese culture and trade across Asia and beyond. During this time, China saw great advances in science, technology, and philosophy, including the invention of paper and the development of Confucianism as the state ideology. After the Han, China faced periods of division and reunification, notably during the Sui and Tang dynasties. The Tang dynasty 618–907 CE is considered one of China's golden ages, with great cultural, economic, and artistic achievements, as well as the flourishing of Buddhism. The Song dynasty 960–179 CE followed, marking a time of technological innovation, including the invention of gunpowder and the compass, and the rise of a prosperous merchant class. However, the Mongol invasion led by Genghis Khan eventually brought about the fall of the Song, and the Yuan dynasty, 1201–1368 CE, was established. The Mongols ruled for nearly a century, but the Chinese people eventually overthrew them, leading to the rise of the Ming dynasty. The Ming era was marked by economic prosperity,
artistic achievements, and the famous naval expeditions led by Admiral Zheng He, which saw China engage with nations across Asia and Africa. In 1644 CE, the Ming dynasty fell, and the Qing dynasty, ruled by the Manchu people from the north, took control. The Qing dynasty lasted until 1912 CE, and is remembered for both its expansion and its eventual decline. During its early years, emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong presided over a period of prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural flourishing. However, the Qing dynasty eventually struggled with internal rebellions, foreign invasions, and the effects of the Opium Wars, which weakened its power. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912 CE, marking the end of over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. Throughout this long history, China experienced periods of great prosperity, artistic achievements, and technological innovations, but also faced challenges of invasion, internal strife, and foreign domination. Today, the history of ancient China continues to influence the country's culture, government, and identity.